So we will go over this, but this period of time in which this is the state in which the books are in is really long, and it has fascinating implications and also actually really affirming ones for what we believe about the wisdom in the Bible. Okay, so, and of course today, even nowadays, we usually regard knowledge while it is being formed as a compilation of previous knowledge. It is not a static, so like for example, our knowledge of history, our knowledge of science, these things, they are not static bodies of knowledge, right? Like for example, where am I going? Okay, so like for example, theories of such things as theories of general relativity, yes, it is more or less a done deal, but there are aspects of that research that are ongoing. This is how we see knowledge in truth. Yeah. So, and of course, as we said in session 1 previously, God's truth is revealed to all people, right? So God's truth, oh, right, I'm very sorry. Yeah. What? We will be shortly. Don't worry, it's fine. No, don't worry. We are quite close to this point anyway, so it's okay. So we said in session 1 previously that God's truth is revealed to all, right? And so it is possible for wisdom to be gleaned by compiling the wisdom of the past, even if it is not necessarily the wisdom of people who we believe are believers in God. That's not quite the same. It's not quite the same sort of wisdom, but there is a general inspiration that comes from God that the discerning can glean. So, yeah, so over to this slide. Who took chemistry at any point? Okay, what's this supposed to be? Yeah, what does it do? No. So this over here is the yes. So this is the process. This is the picture, at least a pictorial representation of the process by which we convert so it's carbohydrates or fatty acid derivatives or protein derivatives into energy, one way or the other. The third of these methods actually produces some toxins, but whatever. So this is the standard form of it. So the citric acid cycle is also called the Krebs cycle because Krebs. So Krebs. So due to the fact that actually so it is named after the person. Why is it called that? Do you remember? Okay, so it's called the Krebs cycle because it's named for the person who discovers it. So this is the person who won the Nobel Prize in 1953, Hans Adolf Krebs. And in truth, although the cycle doesn't say so, he actually discovered this reaction together with his colleague Arthur Johnson. So, and this was itself derived from a previous set of knowledge about a part of the acid cycle, which was discovered by a completely different person, who is from a completely different country. So as you might guess, Hans Adolf Krebs is a German fellow, yeah. But he actually got his ideas from somebody named Albert Ziens-Georgi, who actually also won the Nobel Prize in 1937 for the discovery of fumaric acid, which is actually an important part of this particular cycle. So what we're trying to say here is that what I'm basically trying to illustrate is just that the development of something, the development of this is wisdom, right? This is understanding in its own way. And we can see that the development of this thing, this more advanced understanding of how we convert food into energy, could only really have been done because we treated it as a piece. It's not just static knowledge. It's a piece of knowledge that moves. It increases our understanding of something larger. It increases our understanding of the body. It increases our understanding of how we live and how we are able to sustain ourselves. Similarly, so the Bible posits And Proverbs posits that this, because the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, yes? And how you fear the Lord is you come to know the Lord, or you come to have an experience of the Lord. So if you invert, so the reason why the science thing is up here as well, because if you look at the equation, it goes like this, right? The fear of the Lord, which is actually comprised of the knowledge of the Lord, right, is the beginning of wisdom. So if you invert if you do it ionic equation style and you turn it around, so what is the knowledge of, so wisdom is the knowledge of God, and the gaining of understanding is how you gain knowledge of God. So this is essentially what Proverbs posits. Together with the idea that all heaven declares the glory of God, what we're trying to say is that all knowledge furthers the knowledge of God. This is actually the philosophical underpinning of a lot of sciences. Although people don't emphasize it as much today, this is the philosophical underpinning of a great deal of scientific advancements that we have gained in the past. There's also a lot of Jewish and Islamic influence there. We'll go over this one day. This is a whole other weedy subject. Okay, so, and of course it is, we can this attitude of developing knowledge is something very similar to what the biblical authors would have had. After all, the distance between us, so the distance between us and the next piece of scientific knowledge can be pretty far, right? How much more is the distance between humanity and God? So this road, as they saw it, was something that stretched on ahead of them. After all, as it is said in Isaiah 55, God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts, and God's ways are higher than our ways, even as the heavens are higher than the earth. It's a long way so they thought of it as an up and up climb. It is important for us to remember as well that the educated people of that time would also have been religious people. So these are like your priests, your rabbis, your sages, even people like the Magi. Daniel is considered a prophet, but in the Babylonian court, he would have been considered a magus or a magi. Yeah, he would be one of the magi. Magi is the plural, magus is the singular. And yeah, and if you were a servant in a Greek court, they would have called him a thaumaturge, which is a person who works miracles or somebody who works wonders. Yeah, they all had this particular understanding that this education, this knowledge of science and intelligence was also knowledge of the divine. This is how they understood it. Yeah. So, as long as we're being intellectually honest with ourselves, actually the nature of discovery and truth is that it grows and grows. It doesn't. Of course, there will naturally be debates about what sort of progress we're making and where we are going exactly, but this is the overall thought behind it. Okay. Yay, we have a change of people. Yeah, we have a change of people in our pictures for now. So, when I said the Bible is a compilation of compilations, in truth, Proverbs is just one of the ones that actually has markers on it that tell you that it has been compiled. So there are actually many other parts of the Bible that are less obvious about it, but in truth are actually also put together in some way. So we'll start. So does anyone know what the Torah was comprised of? Yes. Yeah. So the Torah is also known in Latin as the Pentateuch, and this just refers to 5 books. So this refers to the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which is your Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And as you know, actually, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy have a significant amount of overlap. They just cover this thing from a completely different angle. And they do portray some characters in different ways, in slightly different lights, but okay, we'll leave the textual analysis of these things for another day if you are interested. If you're interested, put it in the comments and we'll think about it. And we'll spend some time struggling over it because a lot has been written, a lot of ink has been spilled about these things. It will be interesting, it will be a bit of suffering. So yeah lah, no pain, no gain lah. So the story takes place, the story of, like for example, just the first book of the Torah, the story of Genesis, takes place over a really, really long time. And it actually contains long periods. So the period that is described in this history of the first 5 books, actually, this is actually a period where text and authorship is actually not as important. We'll go on further to explain why that's the case, but text and authorship really isn't that important, which is actually why the first 5 books don't actually mention an author. The titles don't indicate an author, and the stories don't talk about it either. But for example, this is in very great contrast to something like the Gospel of Mark. It rather clearly says on the cover that Mark wrote this gospel, right? This is also complicated, but we'll talk about this eventually. If you're interested, or like, for example, the letter to the Corinthians, right? It starts with Paul, a servant of Christ, such and such, such and such. Or like Philemon, which is, to my dear friend Philemon, it's from your buddy Paul, it starts like that. So authorship is something that becomes more important later in history. This is, if you want just a bit of context, this is actually because Jewish culture is actually initially very focused on oral transmission. So who wrote this is not that important. It's who's teaching this right now. So like, for example, not all texts from the school of Paul's teacher, Gamaliel, are written by him, but he is the spoken transmitter of this tradition, and so the school is named after him. This is kind of how they did it. However, when the Jews came into contact with the Greeks and the Romans, so the Greeks and the Romans are much more defined by what we consider, does anyone know what great man ideas are? Like the idea of the great man? Okay, this is actually a good hint, right? So, the idea of the great man is the idea that there is an author of actions, not just of books, but of actions. We attribute, like for example, the conquests of Gaul, nowadays England, but then Gaul, to Julius Caesar. Even though honestly, he led a whole army and there were a whole bunch of other dudes who were involved, but we think of it as associated with Julius Caesar, right? Alexander, as you say, conquers the Persian Empire, right? That is how it is portrayed. Although it's a lot more complicated than that, and he has all his other buddies with him without whom he'd be dead like 5 times over, but whatever. Yeah, so this is the idea. So when these ideas become dominant, because of course the Greek Empire, and afterwards the Roman Empire become very dominant in their history. So it became more necessary for them to defend their tradition by introducing the idea of authorship. That's why you see later biblical texts quite clearly have an author, or they at least clearly post an author there, because it is important to show that people bear witness to this event. It becomes very important. Like for example, later, because actually you'll see that, we'll go over this as well, but witnesses actually are already very important in their culture. It's just that they didn't need to be named at first. But as you can see much later in the New Testament, it becomes like the meta. It is the thing, right? Everybody talks about there were many witnesses, I was a witness, we have learned this from eyewitnesses. This is incredibly prevalent. They didn't need to do this in the Old Testament at all, because they were just writing for themselves. They don't need that. They didn't, or rather that wasn't their concern. Yeah. So just as a quick side note, so does anybody know who the fella the silver looking fella is? No, it's actually a Jew. And actually that is not an old coin. That is actually a bust in the US Congress building. Yeah. Yes. So, this fella's name is, so in his time, he would have been called Maimun. He would have been called Musa bin Maimun, because he lived in Cairo, in Egypt. So this is a 12th century Jewish scholar called Musa bin Maimun, or the Jews would have called him Moshe ben Maimon. In the Western world, we call him Maimonides. And even though he's a Jew, he's actually very important in one thing. He's the person who establishes among Christian and Jewish and Muslim authors the idea that Moses is traditionally the author of the first 5 books. That's his work. Yeah. His arguments are very complicated. I'm not going to go through them, but I'm just saying that. So the idea of authorship is something that develops. It's not something that is just, it doesn't change the content. It doesn't change the content or the key ideas of the first 5 books of the Bible, but you have to understand that this is a concept that grows. Yeah. So specifically, if you're... Yeah. So, sorry? Yeah. Hey, what's the question? Just ask only. Yeah, okay. You guys put it in the Q&A, then later I can talk about it. It's okay. Yeah. So, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second there. My bad. Just look at my notes real quick. Okay, so it is actually a result of later literature in which the Torah becomes known among the Jews as Torah Moshe, or the law of Moses. And this is something, so by the time Jesus shows up on the scene, if you remember, this idea of Torah Moshe is already a thing. Jesus actually alludes to it quite clearly a few times. And in fact, there's one point in John 5:46 where Jesus says, John 5:46 to 47, Jesus says, "There is one who accuses you, Moses, in whom you have set your hope. If you believed in Moses, you would believe me, because Moses wrote of me. But if you do not believe Moses' writings, how will you believe my words?" By which he's trying to say that if the Jews claim that Moses is the one who gave them the law and the authority, then Moses judges. If that is the case, then he's saying that in that case, Moses judges you. Because Jesus claims that he is here to fulfill the law. Yeah. This is, of course, Jesus is not exactly saying that Moses wrote the whole thing, but he's saying that Moses wrote about it, that's for sure. Okay. So specifically, yeah, so Moses is actually known to have written. The Bible is never clear about what Moses wrote. We just know that Moses did write. Yeah. No, that Bosia. Yeah, I'm just saying that the first five books don't mention an author, and it just says that Moses did write things. It just doesn't say what did Moses write. Yeah. I'm just trying to illustrate that actually at this time, they just don't think it's just not that important to them. Okay, so, yeah. So, sorry, let me quickly. Okay, so Kings and Chronicles are also pretty obviously supposed to be compiled things, because they basically pull text from historical texts. And they actually mention these historical texts a lot of times. Like, for example, when a king dies, he goes, "As for the things this king did, are they not mentioned in the annals of the kings of such and such place?" Unfortunately for us, these annals are lost, so too bad. It's too bad, so sad. But we do know that this is a thing that happens. Okay. And, yeah. And so the reason why I mentioned Luke here is because Luke is actually the most explicit about the fact that it is a put-together story. So, yeah. So so this is the introduction to Luke. Okay? So Luke basically says, many people have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. So it's just, a lot of people have written, he's trying to say, a lot of people have written about this, a lot of people have talked about this. And the eyewitnesses has passed it down to us. Luke is actually kind of suggesting here that he's himself not necessarily an eyewitness to everything. So he says, I have carefully investigated, so what he's saying is, I have gone through all these previous accounts, and now I am compiling it together, and so I will give it to you. Okay? It is actually not, by the way, it's not known if Theophilus is a real person, or if he's just, because Theophilus is an interesting name, it actually refers to also lover of God. So it can mean that. So it can be a person's name, or it can be pseudonymous, which means it's just another word for a believer, someone who loves God. Yeah. So if you just picture in your head for a second. So
So the capital letter doesn't have any connotation on whether it's a name or whether it's a description of a person.
okay, this is actually because yes. So in the this
I'm inquiring
yes,
the original text in that original language.
it would not have, there would have been no capitalization. It would just have been the Greek words theophilos, which is lover of God. Yeah.
Yeah. So actually it may not be a name, but that's what I'm saying.
Yes.
This capital letter T has got no meaning
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah. So actually the issue with this is that it's written in what is known as Koine Greek, and Koine Greek is known for actually using a lot of plays on words. So while we think that puns are really lame nowadays, right? They love it. No, we think puns are a little lame nowadays, but they loved it. Yeah, so their idea of how to write also very different from how we like to write. We go like, oh, you know what? It's a pun day, you know? Like for example, like for example, Uncle Pang's gonna teach today, and somebody goes, "Hey guys, it's gonna be a really pang day, don't you think?" It's just like, yeah. In the old days, they'd be like, "Woo, that's so funny." Nowadays, we're just like, yeah. Yeah, so there's a big difference between how, it's something that's worth considering, definitely. How they thought about writing and how we do it nowadays. This was the idea of a joke. So, yeah. So, actually, if you think about it for a second, what stories would the disciples, so we know that, so we believe that the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are at least like very much based on the experiences of the disciples. So what parts of Jesus' life do you think the disciples wouldn't have been around for? Any ideas?
When he was alone in the desert with Satan's temptation.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
He was alone whenever he was alone.
Yeah.
And also the period where he was growing up with Joseph and Mary.
Yeah, because that's actually correct. Because most of them are contemporaries of Jesus. They are not really that much older than him, or so we know. So, at least as far as we know, most of them were not really that much older or younger than him. So, yeah, they clearly would. Some of them wouldn't even have been born at that point. Yeah. Yeah. As in, when Jesus was a kid, some of them might not have been born. How are they going to see that? So, yeah, they would have to have asked. Of course, Jesus might have told them, and they would ask Mary, you know. How was Jesus as a boy? So, tell us stories of the rabbi as a child, you know. Yeah, like that. It would have to have been like that.
The wine, especially when he changed water to wine.
Yeah. Also,
Only
not.
the mother would know.
Yeah, because only she was with him at that point. Yeah, nobody else was around. Yeah, so that is kind of how they would have done that system, and it would have been, of course, and we will explain later that this would have been related in a very different way from how we would think about it, like how they would transmit this information. It's not quite the same as how we would think about that. Okay. So this is, I forgot to change the slide here also. Okay, so this is just very, very quick. This is just very, very quick. We'll go over this super fast, which is just that the Bible actually, this is just an extension of what we talked about earlier. There is a whole bunch of extra biblical texts, some of which are not actually lost. Some of them are, some of them are not. That the Bible just refers to it as a kind of like, you know this thing, you know that thing, this thing exists. Yeah, so the book of Enoch is actually a thing that exists, and it's essentially a book of prophecy as well. So it is actually referred to in Jude and in Hebrews, where, if you remember, where does Enoch first appear?
He's the guy who walked with God and disappeared.
Yeah, correct. So he appears in Genesis at first, although Genesis says nothing about Enoch's exact relationship with God. But Hebrews actually states that Enoch received revelation from God during his time. So that's like new information added from this particular book. So whoever wrote, even though we don't consider the book of Enoch to be part of biblical canon today, the person who wrote Hebrews was just like, you know what, this is still all right. I think this is fine. Yeah. So unfortunately, the annals are mostly lost. We've actually lost most of the annals that are referred to in the Bible. The annals of the kings of Persia are gone, unfortunately. We don't have them. The annals of the kings of Babylon are also mostly gone. And yeah, the Israel and Judah is just, unfortunately, the book of the wars of the Lord is also, also really not a thing anymore. Yeah, it's referred to in Numbers and Exodus as a sort of record of the battles that they fought during that process. But it just isn't there anymore. Too bad for us. Maybe we'll discover it someday, though. Research is ongoing in the Middle East to find some of these things. We might find it someday. Yeah, so, and the other thing we want to talk about is how, so I did say that some of the sections of Proverbs are written out of order if we just think about time. But the Bible is often arranged in a form that emphasizes theme over chronology. So, wow, I'm really putting out the Kings and Chronicles. I realize it appears a lot in these slides, never mind. But it is true that they actually focus on the same time period, but they have completely different perspectives. So, Kings has a larger focus on the kings of Israel, while Chronicles has a bigger focus on the kings of Judah. While Chronicles actually Chronicles is a lot more, Chronicles also has a bigger perspective about the idea of the line of kings that will eventually lead to, yes. So, just as an interesting note, Chronicles would actually have been the last book. So, Chronicles is Chronicles is somewhere in the early middle of our current Bible, right? But in the Jewish Bible, they will put Chronicles at the end. Because Chronicles is very largely about the prophecy of a descendant of David who will come and rule Israel forever. So yes, it is about that. So to them, this was fitting to put it at the end, because it talks about God's promise to David that though the line of kings has failed for now, because it actually ends with Judah falling apart, right? But it says that, but essentially it says, though the line of kings fails now, there will be an eternal king. So it's actually at the end of it's actually at the very end. After all the prophets, after all the whoever, who actually all lived after the period. So, Revelation's only in the New Testament. So the Hebrew Bible is actually organized with firstly with the first 5 books, and then they have the prophets, and then they have the writings. So funnily enough, the writings, like stuff like Psalms and stuff, would be at the end, not in the middle as we put it. So because they categorize it by theme in this way. And actually, our modern Bible also kind of does that. It changes a few things around, but it's still organized largely by theme. This is also why the Gospels are together, right? Even though they are not exactly in chronological order, they don't they don't tell you different parts of They don't tell you it's not Matthew is part 1, Mark is part 2, Luke is part 3. No, they are all part 1 to, they are all the full, they are all the full trilogy by themselves. Okay. And of course, the third one that we're going to mention is Paul's letters. Paul's letters are actually largely organized. You can actually see a certain progression of Paul's thought through the letters, which is the last of Paul's letters, actually. No, it's none of the above. Yeah. Also, Titus is almost the last. Philemon is written by him. We do know yet. Yeah. So actually, the last letter, Jude is written by somebody who claims to be the brother of Jesus. Different. Okay. Anyway, so the final letter by Paul is actually a personal letter written by him to his friend Philemon about a slave who has escaped from Philemon named Onesimus. And Paul says, Philemon, Onesimus ran off to me. I think I know, everybody knows. But Onesimus is coming back to you. So will you accept Onesimus, this slave, back as a free man and as your brother in Christ? Which doesn't look like a lot to us now. It doesn't look like that much to us nowadays. But back then, it was like, 天下大乱. Because So it is important to know that the Roman Empire was the Roman society was very, very hierarchical. If you thought Asian society was hierarchical, or still is nowadays, oh, forget it. The Roman Empire is nuts. Basically, you have to achieve the amount that it requires for somebody to change their social class is wild. And it's already wild for men. For women, you can forget it. Let's just put it like that. Okay? Basically, children, women, no rights. You only have rights when you become a man. A specific kind of man, to be exact. Preferably not a slave. Slaves also have no rights. No need talk. And Paul is essentially asking this guy who is a rich man of standing to say, this slave is your equal because he is in Christ. That is a huge deal. He's asking something really huge from his friend. He has to do a lot of convincing. He does a lot of convincing in this thing, like, you know. Yeah, if you read it, he does a lot of clever convincing. But yeah, so, and of course, Paul, in some of his earlier letters, in a situational sense, emphasizes hierarchy, right? To some extent. Like in the situational case of the Corinthians, he does say that, that women shouldn't gossip and speak too loudly and things like that. He's talking in a situational sense. But here, at the end at Philemon, he's basically saying that actually, when we are in Christ, by right, in practice, we should all be equal. Has this been achieved in the church nowadays? Not quite. We're not quite there yet. I mean, 2,000 years on. 2,000 years on, you could still argue if we're there yet or not, but you can see that this is why this is the last letter of Paul is trying to say that we should make everyone equal. So, yeah, please practice what we are preaching. That's what he's saying. Yeah. So that's the thematic organization. So that's another one thing to understand, that chronology doesn't really affect Proverbs and other books of the Bible as much because of they are put together in a thematic way instead. Or rather, that's more the emphasis. Except in cases where chronology is super important. Like for example, in terms of genealogy, you're not going to say that your grandfather is actually your grandson. Nobody's going to say that. It's factually incorrect. Okay. So in summary, what we were trying to say earlier is that purpose informs the theme, and the theme informs structuring. The purpose of a book informs what it's trying to say, and what it's trying to say informs how it will be put together. Okay. Wow. Okay. So this is the second thing I was going to say. And this is actually, Joel actually asked a really good question in the previous session, which is that are some of our technologies with which we use to define authorship and date text reliable? The answer is not perfectly. And in truth, what I was trying to say earlier is that to some extent, these things wouldn't actually have been very important. I said a lot about that, but we haven't explained. Okay? So in previous sessions, we effectively talked about the Bronze Age as the cradle of many of these early civilizations that exist nowadays as well. What we didn't really talk about was how they transmit and how they transmit information and how they verify information. Like, because passing the message along is not just the only thing, right? You have to ensure that it gets passed correctly. If not, I mean, everybody's played telephone, right? Yeah. It can muck up. It can muck up. It can get lost in translation. How did they ensure that wasn't the case? So let's just show Okay. So we are going to have to go over this because this gives you a picture of how this worked out. Can you all see the line? Or is it not thick enough? Okay. Sorry. Okay. So this is like 5000s BC. Like clay and stone tablet writing. This is like your very early writings like Sumerian or like old like Devagadra. Does anyone know what Devagadra is? So Devagadra is a form of Indian script. So this is like old stuff. So they wrote it on like clay. At first they wrote it on stone, and then they wrote it on clay. I should probably put stone first because stone is before clay. Because clay requires some work to put together. If not, it's just wet mud, right? Yeah. So this is how it is at first. And around the 4000s, you get papyrus. So papyrus is the first form of paper. It is the really low-tech version. It's really low-tech compared to paper. So, but papyrus actually remains one of the most mobile ways of writing for several thousand years. It's several thousand years until they invent what is called parchment. So parchment is dried animals, tanned and dried and processed animal skin. So, Paul was friends with a tanner, right? Yeah, it's free paper. Yeah, you are buddies with the tanner, free paper. That it likely contributed to his ability to write more, in fact. Not wrong.
Because it's very expensive.
Yeah. We will talk about just how expensive it is later also. But yeah, so this is why Paul is, let's not put Paul in such a mercenary light. But it is one of the advantages, let us say, of Paul having a tanner for a friend. Free paper. Okay. So, it is also around this time that the first full compilation of the Bible, or as the Hebrews knew it, is done. So this is called the LXX, or the 70, or the Septuagint, which just means the writings of the 70. So why is it called the 70? So the story is basically that the Greek king of that time, Ptolemy II, he was basically just like, I need more books for my library. Come, Jews, what is your best text? And the Jews were like, do we really need to translate this for this guy? Really? It's like, okay, never mind. So eventually, after some debate and some grumbling, because they actually regarded, at this time, translation of their holy text into another language was considered blasphemy. Among more conservative rabbis, it is basically considered blasphemy. But they were like, okay, fine, you're the emperor, whatever. And so they got, it's actually 7 days. So Jewish tradition states that 12 people, so six people were chosen from each tribe of Israel to translate this text. And that's why it's called the work. It should technically be LXXII or 72, but 70 was a nicer number, and so they just went with that. Why? Never mind. Why is the story like that? Yeah, I read the whole story, and eventually they were like, and so it is the work of the 70. I'm like, wait, it's 12 times 6 is 72. And they were like, yeah, I don't care. I'm like, okay lah, your story, your rules. Okay, sure. Okay, so this is something I didn't know before Joel asked this question, actually. I went to go look into it, and this came up. So this is actually a different Hebrew Bible that was written later, was compiled later on, called the Peshitta. And this is written in Syriac or Aramaic, which is, as you know, one of the languages that Jesus would have used in his day. So this is written for that time. Yeah, it's around there. Jesus was alive around the time they were putting this one together. Yeah. 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 So it's worth understanding that up to this point, writing is expensive and it's also problematic because papyrus, so the issue with papyrus is that it requires very dry environment. So if you wonder why papyrus doesn't really survive very long or doesn't appear outside of relatively dry places like the Levant and Africa, it's because papyrus requires a dry and it requires you to keep the environment very dry. If not, it starts to mold and then it starts to break. Also, if you sit on it wrong, fold it wrong, scroll it wrongly, it also breaks. Unsurprisingly, most of the pieces we have nowadays are not whole pieces, but they are more like fragments. It's a miracle if you can find like a nice looking sheet, or kind of nice. Yeah. So, and the issue with parchment is that it required some very specialized skills to do. Again, one of the advantages of having a tanner for a friend. Yeah, so up to this point, yeah, who works with animal skin. Sorry, I forgot to say that. Yeah. So there's about to be a sea change all the way across the world. Yeah. Yes. So in the middle of the Han, at the beginning of the Han Dynasty, a eunuch named Cai Lun actually invents. Yes, his name is Cai Lun. He invents paper as we know it nowadays. Paper made from wood hemp. Yeah. It's still in its early stages. What? No. Hemp. Yeah, he uses wood hemp to make paper, which is how we do it nowadays still. But this is like the prototype, the 2版, okay? This is like version 1. Actually, maybe not even version 1.0 yet. Okay. Yeah. So just think about it. For 5,000 years, they were writing on like, honestly, cui. Honestly, cui. The writing is cui. For real. Okay. But from then on, things start to accelerate. So in the 500s, you get what is known as the Masoretic text, which is the first full Hebrew Bible. And of course, at some point in between Cai Lun's invention and the Masoretic text, the Christian text is starting to debate the full set of books of the Bible. We're starting to debate this. Okay, the next big change actually occurs in the Islamic Golden Age, which is the place which is in Iraq and Iran, thereabouts. Iraq, Iran, Egypt. So this is the first paper assembly line. So this is like mass-produced paper. And then soon after that, you actually have the mass-printed Bible. Actually, it still takes another 3-4 centuries, to be honest. But yes. And of course, this is history, right? This is this is the Gutenberg, and not long after because the Gutenberg essentially just means that we can now mass print Bibles. So it's not long until you get what we now know as the King James Version, and things just accelerate from there. So these are your the last 2 notes here are just a little bit of reference for you. So if you think about it, the amount of time within which we have had cheap paper is actually quite short. Like cheap paper is maybe like 400 or so years of time. Okay? Compared to this whole period, just to set the stage, this is that whole period of there's just not much there. If you're wondering who by the way, the guy on the Islamic thing, the guy on the Islamic note of the Golden Age is not actually a Muslim. He is actually a Arab Christian. So his name is actually Abu Zayd Hunayn bin Ishaq bin al-Ibadi. He's Christian though, despite the name. Yeah, he has a very Arab-sounding name, but he's an Arab Christian, and he actually he's actually one of the leaders of the translation movement during this time. So translations of scientific texts, translations of the translations of the Bible, translations of literature, poetry, science. They did that in this time, and he was kind of the leader of the scribes. Okay, so I didn't change the slide. Jeez. Okay, so can anyone see the red circled area here? Yeah. So the reason why paper was so expensive at this time is actually because you can only find it in one place in the world. There's one place in all the world in which this paper actually exists. It's literally just the Nile part of Egypt. It's not even all of Egypt. It's just that part that's close to the sea. Yeah. Yeah, so if you look at how it looks on a satellite, you can kind of see why this is the only place where you can properly grow anything. Yeah, so the papyrus could be found on the banks of the Nile, which flows down through Egypt. Yeah. So this is kind of, so if you find it, so remember in the previous session we talked about how some of the Jewish texts have great similarities with Egyptian ones, right? This is kind of why that's the case. Because they dominate the economic system of being able to produce paper, they dominate the paper industry. So of course most books and other things come from there. Nobody else actually had the ability to produce these things. Yeah. So I actually ran some math. So nowadays, how much is your 500? How much is 500 sheets of A4?
100 sheets of A4, $10.
Yeah, it's not very expensive, right? So this is 500 sheets of A4. It's about 2.5 kilos. Okay? Yeah, it's about 2.5 kilos. So papyrus is considered to have been worth half its weight in gold. So half its weight in gold. So just think about it. Right now, 1 kilo of gold is 65,110 USD. That last conversion as of last Wednesday could have changed. But yeah, so this is how much gold weighs. So it's how much gold is worth. So 500 sheets of A4 is 2.5 kilos. So if you were to take 500 sheets of papyrus just to write on papyrus, it would actually be, yeah, so it's essentially, it really is a lot. Oh my goodness. Yeah. So it is almost 200,000 USD, which is, yeah, you could buy a house. You could buy a small house with 500 sheets of paper. Of course, it has depreciated greatly. It's actually still kind of expensive but more for exclusivity reasons.
Depreciated what? The gold value?
Of course, lah. Of course. Nowadays we have paper.
Of course you got paper.
Yeah, yeah.
Saying at that time the gold value, somehow that gold value then
Yeah.
is lower than what's the gold value now. Higher, lower.
Depending on period, it would have been higher or lower. Yeah. So, okay. So what I'm trying to get at here is that it would have required a hilarious amount of riches to write anything. That's just what I'm trying to put across here. So if you look at the history, so now circled in red over here, is this the correct slide? Yeah. Yeah, now circled in red here is the period in which the Bible itself was being put together. Both the Old Testament and the New. Okay, this is the period. So if you look at it, most of it still is comprised of the period where writing is just the writing is the privilege of the rich, the ridiculously rich, or people who have tenor friends, right, Paul? Yeah. But yeah, this is what it is like. So this actually also does explain why actually the tradition of biblical writing, or actually biblical writing itself, tends to focus around important figures, like kings and such. Because literally only kings would really have had the money to sponsor this kind of thing, in truth. That's why you think this actually does go a good way to explaining that, like priests, prophets, and kings. These are important people in society, people who have actually had access to writing. That actually does explain quite a bit of how the Bible ends up being put together. Yeah. This is true. We consider them to be, this is actually a very good point. By our modern standards, they would be considered illiterate, but because most people couldn't write at all, literacy also wasn't as important. You are not wrong. Yeah, yes. Yeah. That's actually exactly correct. Because illiteracy is only a big problem if there are many things that have been written, but no one can read them. But in the times where nobody could read anything, or nobody could write anything, there was nothing to write on, literally. Why is literacy that important? It isn't. Can converse, can listen. So what we're trying to get at here, yes, the oral tradition. Yeah, so we're trying to paint the scene here of why the oral tradition was so dominant in those days. And this is essentially why that's the case. Okay, so how did they avoid the telephone problem? Okay, so we have actually done quite a lot of studies a lot of studies have been done into societies that still use the oral. I'm putting it in piece by piece. That still do the oral tradition. There actually are still people who follow the oral tradition nowadays. And through that, and through records of societies that once did, we can actually see how this comes together. This flowchart is going to be quite simplified, but it basically looks like this. So we start off with a source writing or a source storyteller from These are usually quite rare, and they're usually singular in nature. Okay. So, and then of course it's more than, it can be more than 3 lah, but I'm just for the sake of space. So it's oral storytellers that branch off these stories. And these oral storytellers will tell these to witnesses. So these people who hear the story firsthand or hear the relation firsthand are considered witnesses. And there may not be, but there can be a successor to the storytelling tradition. Like your dad, your dad was your dad is big chief storyteller, you are small chief storyteller, like that. Okay, that leads to, hang on. Oh, why was that like that? Okay, so there are outside contextual, there's outside like context, and so you discuss the story, and what you do is sometimes the story itself doesn't change, but the focus of the story shifts. Like for example, I talked about how a focus on authors becomes more important in later theory of the biblical tradition, because authorship has just become more and more of an issue. So the focus kind of shifts a little bit, but they by and large try to keep the stories. They keep the story straight. The focus can shift a bit left and right. Okay, so eventually what we get is community debate. So this is how people kind of keep the story straight. You hear this, you heard this, you heard this, you heard this. We will debate and discuss. This sounds funny in a time of writing, but back when there was nothing to do but talk, this is how they discussed it. So, and then this cycle basically continues until you get like an nth. Oh wow, why does it look like that? Sorry. Once you get the nth generation of witnesses, and eventually there is enough. This can happen at any time, but this usually does take a while. So there is subject matter experts that come together, and then you get a second written copy. So, in the case of the Bible, actually, I'm not going back all the way, never mind. In the case of the Bible, that was a process of like several hundred years, between mostly oral to mostly textual. Okay? So this is a process that can repeat as well. If you wonder what other cultures actually still use the oral tradition nowadays, actually Polynesian cultures still do. The Maori still follow the oral culture, where they speak poems and songs to one another that talk about their history. And in the Indonesian peninsula, you have people like the Darari, who are, they are actually related to the Maori in some way. Yeah. Yeah. We do have it as well. Less so. Yeah. To be fair to us, we did invent paper relatively early, so we made the Chinese is an interesting point. We made the change a bit earlier because, of course, paper was first invented in, we use bamboo. Yeah, we use bamboo. Yeah, and paper was first invented in China, so we made the change faster. Yeah. Yeah, we did do that. Before that, we wrote on bones. Bones. 骨头. God. Hey, you just need enough bones lah. How many bones in something? Yeah. Yeah, clay is actually really important. Although, unfortunately, because of the nature of clay, most of the ones that we find are broken into pieces. So kings would often write on stone in the era of clay and such. Yeah. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah.
So if you have something important to summarize, maybe the next 5 minutes you can close it.
Wow. Okay. So in this time, instead of the tools that we talked about previously, things like story spread, story relevance, so it's how it stays relevant over time, how the story spreads among people, and how a story converges. Like what are the convergent elements? They would have been more important to people as markers of text. And when it comes to convergence, the Bible absolutely owns, don't worry. It absolutely owns. So, the Old Testament has the largest singular collection of ancient writing ever. Where? Does anyone remember? So, it has the largest singular place in which Yes. So this is called the Caves of Qumran. So the location is in the Caves of Qumran, and the Dead Sea Scrolls alone put the Old Testament at the top, already at the top tier of how many of these old scrolls still remain. We can even see that there were some differences in theology based on the difference in focus. The content is the same, but the focus and the commentaries were already quite different at this time. Yeah. So some of the pictures over here feature the Great Psalms scroll, which is actually one of the most substantial, preserved manuscript of Psalms. It's actually still, you can actually still read quite a few Psalms on the thing. Yeah. If you know how to read Hebrew, if you don't know how to read it, then too bad for you. I mean, I can't read too much of it either, so never mind. Okay, so I'm just going to do there's a graphic, so as a graphical reference, so if you want to be incredibly strict, so if you want to be very strict and you only take the parts of scripture that are in the original language of writing, everything else doesn't count, we wreck face. Just in terms of story spread and story convergence, you roll face. Don't worry, this is actually well before. So the reason why only Greek is considered is because Latin is not considered here because give chance to everybody else. No, okay. Less of a joke. Christianity finally becomes recognized as a religion in the Roman Empire in 313 AD. So it's about 300 years, slightly less than 300 years after Jesus' death. Only then is Christianity recognized as a religion. So before that, it's a minority thing. The fact that so much stuff survives since then, it's pretty epic. Yeah, we do a really good job. Yeah. And also the Greeks cheat a little. The Greeks cheat a little bit because Greek is still an extant language for a really long time. While the writing of Christianity in specific, that would have been in Greek, only really has about 100 years to be around, before it gets replaced slowly by Latin, as Christianity takes root in Rome, which is actually a long process and doesn't really finish ever. Yeah. So, what we are trying to say is that, of course, 有风, feng feng yu yu, there's a lot of that. But in truth, Proverbs still retains today this core of truth that is drawn from a diverse set of wisdom literature. And it retains many common themes across a wide spread of textual and also oral tradition that actually remains to this day. People still, in many ways, we still maintain both these traditions, so to speak. So next time you read Proverbs, just think about it. You're holding the wisdom of the ancients for thousands of years. It is coalesced in the palm of your hand in your app. Yeah. And one of the core topics, one of the very interesting topics that Proverbs covers and has always covered is what we're going to talk about in future sessions. That is this. So the word I used here is Mashiach. Yeah, or as the Arabs would know it, is Al-Masih, which is the Messiah, or yeah. Nowadays we call it Messiah. Yeah. Yes. And yeah, we are done with this session. Thanks for your patience, everybody. This was a while, I know. I actually haven't looked at whether you all left any comments or anything. Correct or not?
We don't have time for questions.
Yeah.
Write in the questions into the
Okay.
Mandy website and then
Yeah.
Ian
So
will look through.
what's going to happen is that I know there's been a lot of content already. If you have any comments, it's not only questions. Even if you don't think you have any questions, if you have anything that you thought that was not clear, anything that requires more elaboration, anything of that kind, just put it into this thing. And next week we'll have a short session where I just go over these things. Yeah, that's why next week, very short session. I'm just gonna go over your comments and 东西. Yeah. So again, comments, not just questions, comments, clarification. Like you need something else, you want something else explained. Any comments you want to give me, I'll respond to them live next week. Yes.
If you're not available, every recording Ian's sharing is uploaded in our church YouTube channel. So please go there and see if you're not around.
Yeah, so
In case people will. Today's session is live. Live, right? Actually, normally we try to do it live, right? Every time, no. Last time we didn't.
yeah. Just put in anything. Next week we'll have a shorter session in the interest of Chinese New Year, but we'll go over all your various questions and comments. Actually, very much, it'll be very much appreciated. Yeah.